Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Is Your Clinical Supply Playbook Ready for Phase 2 and Beyond, presented by Catalent. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Pharma, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Kristen DeVito, Global Director, Clinical Supply Management, Catalent, and Pete Young, Director, Quality at Catalent. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentations with a Q&A session, so please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. You can find answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. That pretty much covers our house cleaning, so why don't we go ahead and begin. Kristen, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe, for the introduction. So first, a bit about us. Catalent is a leading provider of global clinical supply solutions, experienced in working with companies in clinical trials of all sizes. Catalent has full service capabilities to be an end-to-end clinical supplies partner. Our services include clinical supply management, commercial, comparator, and reference product sourcing, packaging and labeling, specialty handling and cold chain, and clinical storage and distribution, and also returns and destruction. Catalent has an extensive network of GMP packaging facilities in the U.S., Europe, and Asia Pacific, plus a network of over 50 audited and managed third-party depots to support our customers' clinical supply needs virtually anywhere in the world. We have the practical experience to understand and anticipate potential clinical supply challenges on a local, regional, and also global level, ensuring all variables can be considered as we develop your supply chain strategies. So in today's discussion, the first part of the presentation, we'll explore some of the common challenges experienced by sponsor companies. We'll explore study characteristics that significantly impact the complexity of clinical supply delivery, discuss key challenges inherent with progressing through the clinical trial phases, and also some project management and communication best practices. In an effort to better understand the challenges facing today's clinical supply professionals, Catalent partners with BioPharmadive to survey and assess perspectives of executives and key stakeholders within the trial sponsor arena, as well as CROs, healthcare institutions, research institutions, and consulting firms. The survey responses indicate that regardless of the size of the organization, both large and small sponsors express similar challenges when it comes to understanding and managing the clinical supply of their studies. The survey receives responses from 189 industry professionals. The largest percentage of respondents identified as working for a pharma or biotech company with a mixed focus on both small and large molecule. Just under 7% indicated the size of their organization as 10,000 employees or more. The remainder fell nearly even between less than 25 employees and up to 10,000. Sponsor and service providers, like CROs, each face challenges in understanding and effectively managing the supply aspects of their studies. Efficient planning and management of clinical supplies can be challenging for clinical sponsors, especially those with smaller internal teams or with fewer resources. Many sponsors struggle to understand and effectively manage various aspects of the clinical supply chain, including increased pressure from government regulators like US FDA and the European Medicines Agency on quality requirements, and how to move clinical supplies between countries. Development of new medicines around the world becomes increasingly complex as trials advance through the clinical phases due to a range of issues, from changing import-export regulations, complex temperature-controlled supply chains, and planning uncertainties that increase as new regions, additional sites, and patients are added to the mix. Implementing the right strategies for clinical supply can eliminate concern of a missed patient dose due to delays or interruptions in the supply chain. Achieving a successful strategy requires complex considerations beginning at the earliest planning stages of the trial. Even for phase 2 trials, a majority of companies are planning for the clinical supplies post-manufacturing over 6 months to a year in advance. Oncology studies may progress differently and may start with phase 0, which are exploratory studies that often use only a few small doses of a new drug in just a few patients, and further development may combine subsequent phases. The intent, of course, is to speed up the drug development process, and this means that complex supply challenges may also be faced earlier in the development for oncology trials. Also in the mix are phase 4 post-marketing trials, which have very different characteristics that we won't be discussing today. Phase 1 first-in-human trials are relatively small. Manufacturing quantities are typically not at issue. However, the formulation of the dosage form itself is still under development, and the stability data available will greatly influence pack design, often with more restrictive storage requirements. The dosage form at this stage may bear little resemblance to the final commercial form. Due to short duration of trials in this phase, with proper planning, shelf life of the IMP is not typically as critical of a challenge as in later phase trials. Also, due to the limited number of clinical sites and patient enrollment, blinded phase 1 trials often employ unblinded pharmacists to manage randomization and dispensing of IMP at the sites. Keep in mind, though, that if a randomization and supplies are packed to a site stratification, it's best to plan up front for additional potential clinical sites to be added to the study. Phase 2 studies can be very complex dosing schemes across multiple countries and regions with dozens of sites and will most commonly employ central randomization. Because of this complexity, randomization and trial supply management services, also commonly called IRT or Interactive Response Technologies or IVR, IWR, are introduced. These systems manage treatment allocations as per the randomization scheme. They manage subject enrollment at sites and automate shipments of clinical supply from depots to clinical sites and manage restocking levels at sites. They can integrate with EDC and CTMS systems that manage patient data. Most IRT systems can also be set up to manage temperature monitor deviation reporting and also facilitate workflow and hold data for returns and reconciliation of clinical supplies. If using an IRT, adequate time should be planned for the development and validation steps for the IRT system to be built, so please consider this as you start into the phase 2. Also to consider is that multiple countries and multi-language labels require lead time for the translation and manufacture of booklet labels. This process itself can take an average of 3 months. Import and export requirements and regulatory timelines for the planned countries, including who will be importer of record for each country, require careful planning to meet target first patient in dates for each of the countries. Phase 3 trial supply chains can be a beast to manage and most often require outside expertise to assist in effective planning, packaging, and distribution strategies that can be flexible as the trial goes through inevitable changes. Effective supply chain strategies with expert support for import, export, regulatory, and comparator sourcing challenges can make or break your trial. Planning for continuous supply of IMP should take into account variability of site startup and patient enrollment and the shelf life of the products being used. Slower enrollment than planned could result in an overabundance of waste due to expiring products that are not consumed, having a detrimental impact on manufacturing budgets and manufacturing then constraints. Whereas accelerated enrollment could result in an out-of-stock situation if not appropriately anticipated or communicated. The return and destruction process should also be defined at the beginning of the study so that final reconciliation does not become critical path or delay closeout and submission at the end of the trial. The number of factors which impact complexity of planning and managing your clinical supplies are really exponential. Some of the top contributing factors and their impact on clinical supplies will be discussed next. When consulting with our customers to determine quantities required for the study, we are often asked what percentage of overage is typical for a study. The answer really is, it depends. A generically applied or random overage calculation may result in high levels of waste or critical shortage of supplies depending on the study characteristics. In determining appropriate overage, there are considerations for necessary overage or waste required to accommodate the unpredictable enrollment phase of the trial. These include the number of treatment groups and kit types in the studies, factored against the enrollment rate and patient to clinical site ratio. Feeding of kits to sites to provide a buffer for unknown future enrollment is required, in addition to the more predictable kit requirements of future patient visits for already enrolled patients. If the period of unpredictable supply is longer relative to the predictable period post-full study enrollment, such as with competitive enrollment vaccine trials, where there are very few or no additional dispensing visits post-enrollment completion, And a higher amount of overage and eventual waste will need to be planned to ensure supply is available when the patient is randomized and dosed. Titration and dosing variabilities require kits for all potential dispensing schemes to be available for each patient visit and often include investigator choice on dose at the time of the patient visit, adding to uncertainty. Other potential waste factors should be considered, such as damage of kits and the inclusion of an additional kit type not required by inventory levels at the sites, but for maintaining the blind of kit replenishment at the sites. The requirement for an expiry or retest date on clinical labels outside of the United States presents challenges if the clinical supply shelf life does not exceed the duration of the trial. Blinding of supplies requires the labeled retest date to be the shortest expiry of all matching products in the campaign, with the blinded package lot number printed on the clinical label. The potential for a retest date relabeling should be considered when designing clinical labels and kitting strategies to ensure that product can accommodate the additional label as per regulatory requirements. In the EU, not following regulation could result in delays in rework in order to meet these requirements. Also consider the ease of any relabeling operation should it be required. A single label dispensing unit is easier to update and may be able to be updated at the time of distribution using just-in-time labeling strategies as opposed to a complicated kit structure of many layers and labels requiring updated and recollation of the kits. Also make sure to investigate country-specific requirements regarding stability data necessary to support retest dating. Accelerated stability studies may be accepted for some studies and products in some countries and not others. So you may have to have a regional approach to labeling if you want to use the best dating possible on your supplies. A more frequent and continuous supply strategy to mitigate shelf life challenges may just present to be the best option as opposed to trying to continually update the supplies. Effective sourcing of comparative and commercial products can be one of the most challenging, stressful, and expensive aspects of supply chain planning and execution. One should research in advance the markets where you are conducting your trials and thoroughly understand regulatory requirements and constraints so as to identify the best sourcing strategy for your trial. Whether it be a central, regional, local, or combination sourcing strategy or one purchasing direct from the manufacturer through an intermediary, each solution presents its own advantages and disadvantages. Some innovators may restrict exportation and many will request upfront information about the study and the intended use before considering a sale. And this is in order to assure that the product will be used for clinical research and not resold on the open market. That's called parallel trade. Consider what happens when many companies are looking for the same products at the same time and in the same markets. Will there be a potential supply shortage, and do you have mitigation strategies? Sourcing of biologics, especially products used in biosimilar trials, can be highly competitive with a limited number of lots available at any given time and can sell out in a matter of days once available. Blinding a comparator can be extremely challenging and need to consider the possibility that the innovator may change components or presentation of the product mid-trial, and you would have to adjust to maintain the blind. Lack of stability data on commercial products requires strict management of temperature exposure during the supply chain. If working with cold chain products, it is also important to consider kit size and the suitability of kits to fit into qualified shipping containers to maintain temperature during transit, and also consider the storage capacity of the kits at the clinical sites. If your clinical supply is considered as hazardous by IATA requirements, for instance, if products contain alcohol or are pressurized, there may be restrictions on the quantity which can be shipped at any one time, and shipments are required to be packed out by persons who are trained and certified in IATA requirements. This could reduce some flexibility in your distribution plan. If you are working with controlled substances, each country will have its own strict, unique regulatory requirements in import and export, and you will most likely need local depot in every country. To ensure you have a robust strategy, not only for the planning and packaging of the study, but for ongoing smooth management of the supply chain during the course of the trial, it's important to understand who will be responsible for performing supply management tasks. If these roles are not within the expertise of your internal teams or you have resource constraints, you should be initiating a dialogue with your trial partners to be sure that a responsible person is identified. Some of these is to make sure you understand, do you have anyone who is unblinded to manage inventories at the depot sites and in the IRT? If using an IRT, there's often an unblinded supply manager role within the study supply management, and that role would need to be filled. Do you have someone who has experience in defining the requirements and setting up supply modules and algorithms to optimize the supply during the study within the IRT? Already, spoke to understanding overage of IMP requirements and what's necessary for the buy decisions of comparators and the planning and packaging of campaigns. Skilled clinical supply managers have the goal to optimize the supply chain and develop strategies to balance risk against running lean to reduce waste. First and foremost, their job is to ensure that supplies are available for the patient when it's needed, and supplies are not on the critical path for the trial. It's important to clearly establish roles and responsibilities for the management aspects of supply at the start of the trial. Written and agreed RACI communication and project plans will ensure important management tasks integral to supply chain have defined scope, and there's a timing for each of the activities with clear ownership and accountability. As certain regions of the world are added to a clinical study, the logistical and regulatory challenges associated with clinical trial supply distribution can rise exponentially. Even well-established markets will present challenges. Underestimating the often complex logistics necessitated by the sensitive and highly regulated nature of clinical supplies can potentially put a study's budget and timeline, and more importantly, patients at risk. So I'll hand off the presentation now to Pete Young, who will speak to many of the regulatory considerations for your clinical supply chain.
Thanks, Krista. Okay, so in order to talk about the regulatory considerations, I'm going to cover the EU regulatory framework, how the EU regulatory framework calls for a qualified person and what they need to secure, look at regional regulatory differences, look at legislation changes in the EU, I'm going to touch upon Brexit, and then look at some specific quality considerations when moving from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 3 trial. So at the highest level, the EU regulatory framework consists of the primary legislation, such as the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community. Beneath that, there sits the secondary legislation, which consists of regulations, which are immediately effective and binding in their entirety, directives, which are binding in their objectives but are interpreted into national law, decisions, which are immediately effective and binding in their entirety, and recommendations and opinions. So the regulations or directives are what capture most of the pharmaceutical legislation. And as I said, the directives have to be interpreted. So in the UK, they're interpreted into parliamentary acts and statutory instruments. Beneath those, there are reference guides such as Pharmacopoeia, which provide further detail on specific information. So the current EU pharmaceutical legislation for human medicinal products consists of 2003-94 EC as amended, which, sorry, I'm having problems with moving on. So 2003-94 EC as amended, which defines EU GMP. It's Directive 2001-83 EC, which concerns all medicinal products, including. Sorry guys, there's something that you can do to stop it auto moving. Apologies for this. So yeah, 2001-83 EC, which So it concerns all medicinal products, including commercial products, and requires the site to be licensed or with products to be authorized. It also requires the qualified person. I'm not sure if there's something you can do here, moderator, to get this to stop flipping. 2001-20 EC only concerns investigational medicinal products. It includes placebos and comparators. Introduced the specific requirements for QPs into IMPs. It also requires all trials to be authorized through CTAs and ethics approval, and enforces Annex 13. So apologies, I'll flip back and talk through it, but essentially Annex 13 provides the meat on the bones for manufacturers of investigational medicinal products. It covers detailed label requirements in terms of content and the language. It covers that essentially you need a product specification file and returns, destruction and retention samples. In terms of the QP requirements within the legislation, 2001-83 EC defines that you need a holder of a manufacturing authorization, which must have at least one qualified person. It defines that the QP has to have formal qualifications, which must be gained over 4 years, and the QP must have gained practical experience over at least 2 years in a relevant manufacturing authorization with a relevant disciplinary, such as QA and QC. And then the QP has to assess each product batch to ensure it has undergone the relevant full qualitative and quantitative analysis, and all of the tests or checks which are necessary to ensure the quality of the medicinal products in accordance with the requirements of the relevant authorization. 2001-83 EC pulls in those same requirements that are in 2001-83 to IMPs. This is in turn reinforced by Annex 13, which provides more detail on the responsibilities of an IMP QP. And then you have Annex 16, which really provides the detail on what QP needs to secure. This slide, which will be up for a second before it moves on, essentially reproduces the QP requirements that they need to secure. The grayed out sections are those which are specific to commercial products, and really, the purpose of highlighting those sections are really that the QP's responsibilities are broken into 2 sections. There's essentially the activities that a QP needs to perform, to secure the supply chain and confirm that all suppliers in the supply chain are operating in accordance with EU GMP, have the regulatory submission, and that all required audits have taken place. And then the latter activities are what the QP must secure to ensure that the manufacturing and testing activities performed are carried out in accordance with EU GMP and appropriately validated and in compliance with the regulatory submission. Okay, so really what we're going to look at next is some changes that are coming into effect. So before that, we'll just look at really the key regulations that are in place globally. So the Food and Drug Administration essentially looks after the regulatory Code of Federal Regulations in the US. These require that all APIs, excipients and primary packaging components must be GMP. They define the minimal label requirements for clinical trials. In terms of importation into the US, then goods can't enter the US human use unless there's an approved IND in place. And there's also a need to consider before the importation of products into the US, the United States Department of Agriculture requirements if there's a product that has animal derivatives within it. So from an EU perspective, we've looked at the current legislation that's in place. UDOX Volume 4 contains the EU GMP requirements. It also describes the good distribution practice requirements, which in essence, in terms of temperature control, require that a product is stored and distributed in accordance with the temperature conditions stated on the clinical label. But in terms of the QP certification process, the application of the requirements in the member state is driven really by the guidance and interpretation provided by the competent authorities. So, for instance, within the UK, there are MHRA inspector blood guidance, which give clear indication on, the interpretation for a QP perspective. This is not, the same throughout the EU, so that does cause some discrepancies in terms of the way that the regulations are interpreted if a QP doesn't have that source data available to them. There are several mutual recognition agreements in place with the EU. The MRAs allow EU authorities and their counterparts to rely on each other's GMP inspection system. It allows them to share information on inspections and quality defects. It allows them to waive batch testing of commercial products on import into their territories. And what this slide really shows is the exclusions from those agreements. Of particular note in relation to investigational medicinal products is Japan and Israel, where IMPs are not covered by the MRAs at all. And in Australia, Phase 1 IMPs are outside of scope. In the Asia-Pacific region, the agencies tend to be influenced by the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme, and PICS is made up of the Pharmaceutical Inspection Convention and the Pharmaceutical Inspection Cooperation Scheme. By and large, PICS GMP is equivalent to EU GMP, with the exception of the omission of the qualified person. The China GMPs are a combination of PICS and the World Health Organization requirements, and in Japan, pharmaceutical GMP is assured by the Ministry of Health and Labour and Welfare, Pharmaceutical and Medicine Device Agency, and then the prefecture inspectors are delegated jurisdiction by the Ministry of Health and Labour and Welfare. Okay, so looking at the planned changes to EU legislation, with regards to medicinal products for human use, Directive 2003/94 EC, which currently covers EU GMP, is being repealed and replaced with a specific regulation which deals with GMP requirements for medicinal products for human use. UDOX Volume 4 will continue to provide the finer detail on the GMP requirements. For investigational medicinal products, the Clinical Trial Directive 2001/20 EC is being repealed and replaced by 536/2014. And GMP requirements for IMPs will be detailed in a specific regulation, and a detailed Commission guideline will replace Annex 13. So the aims of these changes are really to reduce bureaucracy. The shift from directives to regulations will eliminate the need for national interpretation, which can lead to differences between member states. The application process will be streamlined through the use of an EU portal. This will enable a single set of documents to be prepared and submitted for clinical trial application, enabling the assessment procedure to be harmonised. Applications will be divided into two parts. There will be Part 1, which will be jointly assessed by all member states where the trial is intended to be conducted. Part 2 will be assessed by each member state concerned separately. There will be an extension of the tacit agreement principle, which will provide sponsors increased legal certainty. There will be a streamlined safety reporting procedure which will minimise the need for broadly identical information having to be submitted to each member state, and it will provide increased transparency regarding clinical trial outcomes. Clinical trials conducted outside the EU but referenced in a clinical trial application within the EU will have to comply with regulatory requirements which are equivalent to those applicable in the EU. So over the next few slides, I'll just pull out some of the significant changes that industry will face as a result of the implementation of the clinical trial regulation and the regulation on GMPs for IMPs. So through the current clinical trial directive, the expiry date may be omitted from small primary packs, e.g. vials, syringes and small blisters. So Annex 6 Clause 5 of the clinical trial regulation will require that the expiry date must be present on all primary packs irrespective of size. As a consequence of this, packaging will need to be designed in a manner that allows easy unpackaging of the primary container for expiry update labelling purposes. Article 4, Clause 1 of the Regulation for Good Manufacturing Practice for IMPs details that a manufacturer should ensure that manufacturing operations for investigational medicinal products are carried out in accordance with the documentation and information provided by the sponsor. This is a new requirement which reinforces the need for all manufacturing steps, including partial manufacturing activities like bulk manufacturing, packaging, labelling, to be in compliance with the IMPD and the clinical trial application. Article 4, Clause 2 of the Regulation for Good Manufacturing Practice of IMPs details that manufacturers shall regularly review his manufacturing methods in light of scientific and technical progress and experience gained by the sponsor during the development of the investigational medicinal product. So this clause identifies that the manufacturer shall inform the sponsor of his reviews of the manufacturing method, and this new requirement drives the exchange of information between contract parties, reinforces the need for regular review of manufacturing, which also includes packaging and labelling methods for all activities related to the IMP, supports the development of robust processes by forcing consideration of scientific and technical progress, and it ensures that through communication between manufacturers and sponsors, regulatory documentation is kept current with changes. Article 10, Clause 2 of the Regulation for GMPs for IMPs requires manufacturers to ensure that quality control laboratories comply with the information provided. So while this is generally required for EU GMP, this clause makes it an explicit responsibility of the manufacturer. As a result, there's a need to ensure that IMPD review process is extended to in-house or contract laboratories used for the manufacturing steps under direct or indirect control of the qualified person. This requirement also extends to non-EU facilities that are producing EU IMPs for EU trials. Article 10, Clause 4 of the Regulation for GMPs for IMPs explicitly states that during final control, finished investigational medicinal product, the manufacturer has to take into account, amongst other things, production conditions and the conformity of the product with the clinical trial authorization. So, if the production conditions and conformity are the new requirements, so that will obviously lead to the need to ensure that, the requirements, that this data is, essentially available to the QP in the review data pack. Article 14, Clause 1 of the Regulation for GMPs that all trial sites shall be identified insofar as possible. The countries of destination shall be indicated, and in the case of an authorized investigational medicinal product, the manufacturer shall, in cooperation with the sponsor, inform the marketing authorization holder of any defect that could be related to the product. So the main change really relates to that need to notify the marketing authorization holder of defects with authorized investigational medicinal products used in clinical trials. This will lead to the need to ensure that the requirement is captured in quality technical agreements for services related to comparator labeling and supply. So the clinical trial regulation and the regulation for GMP for IMPs were planned to be introduced in April 2018, this year, essentially. However, the delays with the development of the EU clinical trial portal database mean that the EMA is currently reporting that the clinical trial regulation will likely come into effect in the second half of 2019. I'm now going to look at Brexit. So on the 23rd of June 2016, the UK voted to leave the European Union. This led to the UK issuing a formal withdrawal notice under Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union on the 29th of March, triggering the start of the 2-year negotiation period leading to the EU leaving on the 29th of March 2019. So the negotiations are following a two-phase approach. with phase 1 concluding on the 8th of December with an arrangement in principle which was reached, which included citizens' rights, the Irish border, and the exit settlement. So phase 2 of the negotiations are commencing in March and shall initially work to agree the transitional arrangements with subsequent negotiation determining the future trade relations. So the regulators, are prohibited from any small speculation on the potential outcome. So any guidance that you'll see will be based upon a worst case, a third-party outcome for the UK. But based upon the existing arrangements, it's evident that there are 5 potential regulatory scenarios. We could become a third country, or we could have a European Free Trade Agreement, but effectively that would still amount from a regulatory perspective as the UK being a third country site. So if we're a third country, then the UK sites within like a CTA would no longer be recognised as EU GMP compliant. So a QP declaration would need to be made for all UK sites, including testing sites. UK QP certificates would not be recognised by EU QPs in accordance with Annex 16. If we became a member of the European Economic Area or an MRA country, then UK GMP would be recognised as equivalent to EU GMP. UK QP certificates would be able to be leveraged by EU QPs, but QP certification would be required on receipt of products after transfer from the UK to the EU. If there's a new deal, then potentially it has no impact, but obviously it's very dependent upon the deal. So to look at what the implications of the third country scenario has on a product that's manufactured in a country that has an existing MRA in place with the EU. In terms of audit requirements, there'll be no change in relation to the MRAs that don't include IMPs in scope, such as Japan and Israel and Australia. There's an existing requirement for audits, of products manufactured in those areas and a QP declaration. Post-Brexit, the EU MRAs will no longer apply to the UK. Therefore, the UK will be a third country with Canada, Switzerland, New Zealand, and the United States, and vice versa. So any existing trials the IMPD submitted will continue to stand, and there will not be a specific new requirement for declarations in the UK until the part of any declarations made expire. But any new trial submissions in the UK will require QP declarations for products manufactured in current MRA countries which have IMPs operational. So in terms of QP certification, UK QPs will not be able to leverage batch certification performed in the current MRA countries where there's an MRA in place with the EU. So the implications for products manufactured in third countries that an EU QP certifies to a UK QP. So as the EU withdrawal bill will convert existing legislation framework into UK law at the moment of exit, then there'll be no change to the UK regulatory framework at the point of exit. This would enable UK QPs to continue to accept sponsor QPs or European QPs to provide declarations and confirmations until such time as the UK and EU regulatory requirements diverge. That said, the MHRA have committed to be sensitive to the impact of any changes. So the implications in relation to comparator product. The UK and its competent authority, the MHRA, participate in ICH as part of the EU delegation. As a result, when the UK leaves the EU, it means a departure from the European Union, and therefore, European Union, and therefore it will no longer be a member of ICH. So that would mean that hard Brexit would designate any comparator product sourced from the UK market to be used in the EU as being sourced from a third country and a non-ICH region, which means that under these conditions, responsibility would lie with an IMP QP to confirm that the EU GMP compliance of the UK comparator. We couldn't rely on, obviously, the existing framework. That said, like if you can buy, like a pack that includes a UK and EU library, then obviously that would mitigate any impact. In terms of QP certification implications, you would need the clinical trial application and investigational medicinal product to identify sites in both the UK and the EU that are capable of distribution and QP certification. QP certification for the EU can obviously not be performed until the product enters the EU, or vice versa. Product entering the UK from the EU as the transit and arrive, and obviously be checked for condition and temperature data to support the QP release process in each territory. As the UK will be a third country, the EU QP would not be able to take the EU QP certificate based upon Annex 16. That said, if you're going to partner with a company that has UK and EU QPs, then these are the type of attributes: having a global QMS, having process alignment, having like aligned project documentation, aligned systems, and a corporate audit program will make like the QPs in the respective territories be able to rely upon the certification and minimize the level of duplication in the absence of a regulatory framework that says that those certificates can be leveraged. If the UK becomes an MHRA or an EEA member, then in terms of existing MRAs, the applicability of those will be dependent upon whether the MRA developed with the EU will mean that existing MRAs with the EU will apply to the UK. From a comparator perspective, as an EEA or an MRA country, then a UK commercial pack would be considered to have been manufactured under GMP requirements equivalent to EU GMP. Obviously, that assumes there'd be no exclusions, but given the fact that we're a member of the EU, an exclusion could only be brought about by a divergence from current standards. In terms of clinical trial application, there would still be a need to have an EU and like a UK site identified for QP certification, but obviously that QP certification could take place after transfer into the actual territories, but it would be able to leverage the certification that's been performed by the UK or EU QP. In terms of New Deal, and potentially there's no impact, providing the MRA will pull into scope the existing EU MRAs. As I previously said, like the UK commercial pack is considered equivalent, then there's no implications. Potentially, another site would not be required if it's coming from the UK to the EU or vice versa. If the QP certification would not be needed on transfer, and potentially, that would mean that there'd be no further certification requirements. But all of these would depend on there being a new deal different to anything that's currently out there. So I'm now going to look at some specific quality considerations moving from phase 1 to phase 2 and 3 trials. So in terms of the pharmaceutical quality system, it's likely as you go into a larger trial, you're going to need to add additional suppliers in. You're going to expand the supply chain. You're going to have to manage the supplier approval of the additional sites that come on board, have additional quality agreements in place, and have additional QP audits and declarations within like your clinical trial for third country sites taking place in the EU. The product specification file will need to be maintained as the development proceeds. From a personnel perspective, you need to make sure that you've got people who are blinded and unblinded identified, who have appropriate training and fully understand the implications of the information that they're going to receive. As you increase automation, then there's validation that's appropriate to the level of development is going to be required. Obviously, all the equipment would need to be validated, but in terms of process, then that would be dependent on the product type. You need to do cleaning verification, and therefore there'll be a need for like health-based limits to be developed. The product specification in terms of documentation would need to be maintained. There'd have to be additional quality agreements, and you need to maintain the trial master file and identify the key documentation that needs archiving at the manufacturing packager. So there'll be moving to a requirement for a 25-year retention period in the EU for trial master file documents. So it's critical that that retention period and requirement is built into quality agreements with manufacturers. Key in terms of the certification of a product, really, by a QP in the EU, is that the product specification file, the manufacturing record, and the specific version of the IMPD, which is current, are aligned. So that's a critical requirement that you keep on top of that. And obviously, for blinded or randomized trials, then all of the materials produced, as well as all of the documentation, like shipping documentation, it has to be blinded to maintain the integrity of the blind. If you've got comparators, if there's any modification, then you need to develop stability data and justify the expiry date. Obviously, that expiry date can't go beyond the expiry of the unmodified product. For a modified comparator product, if it's a solid dose, you need to look at disintegration, dissolution, or bioequivalence. You need to factor in the need to maintain reference and retention samples for those modified comparators. And you need to have supply chain pedigree and obviously look at the implications of the source of that comparator. If it's a third country, like an ICH region, or from the EU. Obviously, if it's from the EU, then there's more confidence in terms of the actual supply chain. In terms of blinding, there needs to be a process for rapid unblinding developed, and as Kristen's already talked through, there needs to be the management of blinded expiry date and lot data. As you move up the phases, then there's increased complexity in terms of the packaging. You have dose and titration packs, which could be a mixed fill. You've got comparators and placebos to manage, and then the randomization and expiry update process. Quality control of the comparator and retention samples have to be considered, and the QP certification and release of the batch has to be performed. As I mentioned, QP certification is against a specific IMPD version and PSF submitted to each country. So it's really critical that you have close and continued communication of any updates and any divergence between IMPD versions in specific countries to make sure that as a sponsor, the QP is informed and provided all the current regulatory documentation to permit that certification. In terms of recalls, there have to be clear procedures and defined roles and responsibilities with all parties, and there have to be arrangements with manufacturers and sponsors detailed in protocols for returns and disruptions. You have to define responsibilities for reconciliation, and there needs to be a full traceability of batches and patient numbers. And as Kristen spoke to earlier, you need to maintain that reconciliation and perform that during the trial if you've got a large number of subjects and a real high quantity of product that's actually been shipped out. So, in summary, you need to carefully identify and consider all moving parts of your clinical supply strategy and supply chain as early as possible. Forecasting and demand planning can optimize the supply strategy, and you need to understand the quality regulatory requirements before execution. Complexity can increase significantly between the phases, so you need to understand all current and future regulatory quality requirements to ensure adherence and reduce risk of future issues due to non-compliance. Be prepared to address the challenges on a regional or country-by-country basis if necessary, and clear communication is essential to success because you can avoid issues, with well-defined and agreed-upon roles and responsibilities. You also need to be mindful of pending regulatory changes that may go into effect before all trial phases are completed. Identify areas of risk, develop a plan to address them, and determine how to ensure continuity of supply if the changes mean it will take longer than originally planned for the clinical trial sites to receive the supplies. So with that, I'll open the floor to any questions.
All right, Pete, thanks. We're ready to move on to the Q&A section. A reminder to the audience, there's still time to submit questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We already have a lot of great questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So the first question up is for you, Kristen. How does one secure the supply of comparator drugs if they are owned by another firm? And do you have to buy them from another firm and then repackage?
Oh, get myself off mute here. So it's very common that the innovators of the comparator drugs do supply products for clinical trials, and there's different ways in which you can obtain the drug product for your comparator. You can go direct to the manufacturer, and this is actually your most secure way to supply for your trial because companies such as Catalent, who have good relationships with the actual manufacturers of the comparator and commercial products, they can provide information about how much product would be needed for a duration of time, and that way they know that there's a demand that's out there that that would need to be filled, and there is a sense of competition. Some of the sponsor companies are less willing to support, but for most sponsor companies, they're willing to support these drugs. Now, you do have to provide information about the clinical trial, as mentioned before, and this is to ensure that the products are going to be used for clinical trials and not be resold on the open market. Typically, the type of information that needs to be provided is the same sort of information that's available through clinicaltrials.gov when you've posted your protocol. It's not very as invasive as you might think. Some companies are very wary about alerting another company of a trial in advance, and so may choose to delay to make that information available as long as possible. But if you do source on the open market, then you're really just only able to obtain the products of what lots are available at the time that you're ready to make the buy without advance notice and planning. And then when you do receive the products in, it depends on the country regulations and your trial with regard to blinding or open label if they need to be repackaged. So that's all very dependent upon the trial. But sometimes the commercial products will need to be repackaged and blinded. Of course, the biggest challenge would be to remove a commercial comparator product from its container closure system that's been used to obtain the marketing authorization, and you'd be very hard-pressed to obtain any stability data on that. So the solutions can get quite complicated of how you're going to do any repackaging or blinding to meet the needs of the trial.
Okay, Pete, this next question is for you. If the regulatory submission includes a regulatory commitment for stability, will the QP need memos as more data becomes available?
So you do need the stability memos, but in addition to that, it's critical that the QPs are also provided the full data that supports that stability memo, because they need to obviously fully evaluate that data provided against the the commitment that's made within the regulatory submission.
All right, Kristen, back to you. This is in terms of how to secure the supply for trials on drug combinations. If the drugs are used together with your drug are owned by other firms, the example is in cancer trials, retroviral trials, drug trials.
Right. So the answer to this is very similar to the previous with regard to securing the comparator and commercial drugs. They can be purchased and once again directed to the manufacturer or through open market or wholesalers. And sometimes the clinical sites may obtain the product themselves, but when you decide on what is the best strategy for making sure that you have the supply for your study, you need to consider both the regulatory environment, if there's any current constraints within the market on a particular drug type. Most likely you're going to need to develop a strategy that involves some sort of a regional sourcing with the potential that as a mitigation and backup strategy, if sites have the opportunity to obtain, the products if they're open label, right, in a pinch, if there's any supply interruption. Also to balance is the cost of each of the solutions. So if your sites do obtain the commercial drug themselves, they usually put a pretty high markup on the per dose. And this is much more expensive per unit than for instance, a company such as Catalent able to obtain the products, through to the actual manufacturer of the product or through intermediaries and purchase the products for better pricing in bulk. Another consideration with that is, okay, if you're only obtaining supply, by the site, you need it when the patient has a dose, you might reduce a potential for waste. So really doing a good evaluation of the supply chain, going through the different scenarios, even in using simulation tools to help see how the study will play out and what the purchasing strategies and costs of the different products might be will help you to develop the right strategy.
Okay, Pete, this question is for you. If there are multiple QPs in a supply chain, does all information need to be made available to all QPs?
So I guess if we consider, like information such as audit reports, then it's clear from Annex 16 that audit reports need to be made available to all QPs. And where a single QP is responsible for certification of the entire process, then all the relevant supporting information should be readily available to that QP. But where the responsibilities are shared between one or more QPs, then providing you've defined those respective responsibilities of a QP in a technical agreement, if one of the QP provides confirmation of compliance with EU GMP and CTA for a partial manufacture such as bulk, then that QP just needs to have access to all the relevant parts of the CTA and the relevant audits. And then the final certifying QP is then reliant on confirmation by the first QP, but it doesn't have to have all the information that that the first QP saw. So, this type of interpretation, is supported by, for instance, the MHRA have clarified this through inspectors' blogs. That said, there are regional differences. If you were in Germany, that's not the same sort of expectation, and a German certifying QP would be expected in terms of audits to see all the audits. Despite that, they wouldn't be expected to see all the information that the first QP has certified on. So, the general terms, the QP has to have everything that supports his certification, but there are some regional differences that mean that you really need to engage with your QPs, make sure you're clear on the information required.
All right, thanks, Pete. This looks like our next question will be our final question. We had a lot of great ones today and couldn't get to them all, but we will be getting back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. So the final question is for you, Kristen. Is it best to find a vendor that can handle one-stop shop, including EDC, and also the packaging and distribution of the clinical supplies?
So there's definitely advantages to limiting the number of vendors that you're working with and having to manage, to help within the communication. But really, I don't think there's a single company that can be the best at everything, right? So, the chosen company for the EDC, and it may be a preference of the clinical research organization who's going to be managing your clinical sites and the trial, may have some preferences in the EDC, but they may not be best in class when it comes to the randomization of trial supply management. Sometimes the combination systems have very little functionality or flexibility, and the impact upon that and the ability to optimize a supply chain, be flexible and reactive could be impeded. And you also want to make sure that, you know, you're really reaching out to the experts in the supply chain with regard to your packaging, storage, distribution, et cetera, those who have the global reach and the regulatory, you know, experience to support and make sure that you have a successful trial. So, you know, it's really an investigative process you need to go through, but there are very different requirements and impacts of each of the different pieces of your support for the trial.
Okay, I'd like to thank the audience for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank Kristen and Pete for participating and Catalent for presenting today's webinar. As a reminder, the webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.